Some of my earliest and fondest childhood memories are of school holidays spent roaming these hills in search of adventure. To us then, the Lickeys were a vast wilderness waiting to be conquered. Here we could discover secret places we were convinced no man had ever trodden, plant our imaginary flag, call it ours, and look back in triumph at the world below. As I got older, the hills got smaller, and I realised that those secret places had probably been discovered 1,000 times before. Still, the memories remain, and so do the hills, so that today's children can explore them for themselves. Of course, roaming the Lickey Hills is by no means a recent pastime. When the last ice age ended, around 15,000 years ago, a great torrent of meltwater carved a valley through this ancient landscape. A valley now home to the infant River Arrow that creates the ponds and waterfalls at the heart of the Lickey Range. The warmer climate after the Ice Age brought wild boar to the hills, and a flint arrowhead found on Rednal Hill shows that Neolithic hunters came here in search of dinner from around 5,000 years ago. Much later, Romans crossed the Lickeys on a route they created roughly along the line of the old Birmingham Road. It carried a steady flow of packhorses carrying blocks of salt from Droitwich to their camp at Metchley, where the Queen Elizabeth Hospital now stands, and was one of many saltways that kept Rome and Britain supplied with this vital commodity. Salt was one of the few means of preserving food, and on a long march to quell an uprising, or a long winter defending Hadrian's wall against the Picts, could be the difference between success and failure. Salt was considered so valuable that, often, part of a Roman soldier's wages was paid in salt, hence the term salary. The hills of Roman times were quite different in appearance to today. Trees were scarce, and the area was mainly marshy heathland and scrub. The Romans left Britain sometime around 450 AD, after 400 years of occupation. Now it was the turn of Anglo-Saxon tribes from northern Germany to make their mark. When they reached the Lickeys we don't exactly know, but it seems that by 780 AD they were well established here. In that year, King Offa of Mercia granted Riordanhall to St. Peter's Monastery at Bredon, and Cofton, Bromsgrove and other nearby settlements are all Anglo-Saxon in origin. Under the Saxons, the Lickey Hills provided common grazing land and the opportunity for all to bag a wild boar or deer to keep the larder stocked. The free-for-all came to an end though with the arrival of William the Conqueror in 1066. He chose Bromsgrove, which included the Lickey Range, as one of his royal manors, with the Lickeys a royal hunting reserve, fenced off and out of bounds to all but a chosen few. Strict laws were introduced to protect the King's Forest and the beasts in it. Nobody but appointed officials could kill a deer, and the penalty for doing so was savage and rigidly enforced. If a deer was found dead under suspicious circumstances, an immediate inquest was held, and woe betide anyone found guilty. No one living on the edge of the forest could own a dog longer than 18 inches, and even then had to have 2 of its front claws cut off. It was still permissible to graze animals in the forest, as long as you didn't interfere with the royal deer, but if your beast strayed, they would end up in the pound or pin, where only a hefty fine would get them released. No doubt some adventurous creatures from the Lickeys ended up here in the old Northfield village pound, one of the few remaining examples in the country. The local pin was probably in the area now called Pinfield Woods, on the southeastern slopes of the hills. The strict forest laws also made it illegal to fell trees, cultivate land or build houses on it. There were, though, ways around the law, if you had the will and, more importantly, the money. Often those responsible for administering the forest laws were unpaid officials whose reward was the chance to take a few deer, and more than a few bribes, to turn a blind eye to illegal activity. In those days, a forest wasn't what we think of today. It generally meant an area where deer grazed, and was nowhere near as heavily wooded as other parts, and as such presented an attractive option for settlement. Those enterprising and wealthy enough cleared and cultivated an area of forest, having firstly made sure that the administrator was corrupt, and having saved up enough to bribe him and pay the fine if things went wrong. Barnt Green at the foot of the Lickeys means burnt clearing, and almost certainly originated from one of these illegal forest settlements. There were, of course, serious risks involved in such an enterprise, for both settler and administrator, particularly if the king stumbled across your new home while out hunting. Fortunately for Barnt Green, it seems to have escaped the royal beady eye. Cause for celebration perhaps at the Barnt Green Inn that stands on the site of that original clearing. Other survivors from Norman times make their presence felt on the Lickeys today. Rabbits were introduced to England following the Norman conquest, although it seems the French ancestors of today's variety were a soft lot by comparison. They were provided with mounds of soft earth called warrens, and provided with a warrener to pamper to their every need. Warren Lane was the site of the Lickey rabbit breeding grounds. Of course, all this mollycoddling wasn't actually for the rabbits' benefit. As soon as the creatures were plump enough, they were eaten, and their skin made into all manner of garments, from cloaks to bed socks. The Lickey Hills and other royal hunting grounds, game reserves and rabbit warrens were essential to keep England's new nobility well fed, as this shopping list for Henry III's Christmas party in 1251 shows. 400 red deer, 200 fallow deer, 200 roe deer, 200 wild swine, 1,300 hares, 450 rabbits, 2,100 partridges, 290 pheasants, 395 swans, 115 cranes, 400 tame pigs, 70 pork prawns, 7,000 hens, 120 peafowl, 80 salmon, and an unlimited amount of lampreys. A feast indeed fit for a king. In 1340 we find a clue as to the origin of the name Lickey, when it was recorded that Roger, son of John de Bishopton, became custodian of La Leek Hay. Leek is Old English for stream, and hay is a division of a forest. King's Norton was another royal manor adjoining Bromsgrove, and whose lands included part of Rednal Hill. For convenience, a joint court was held midway between Bromsgrove and Kings Norton, on the site of the old Rose and Crown at the foot of Rose Hill. Here, manorial bailiffs sat in judgment on local disputes involving tenants of the royal estates. Although most of the Lickey range fell within the royal manor of Bromsgrove, a bit of it had a different owner. The ancient manor of Chadwick, including Stock Hill, the Lickey's highest point, is named after St Chad, a Dark Age saint who, according to legend, founded a holy well here. The manor belonged to St Wolstan's Hospital, a small monastic settlement in Worcester, but later passed to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. In 1515 he became Lord Chancellor of England under Henry VIII and set in motion the King's dissolution of the monasteries, which led to the establishment of the Church of England. Wolsey founded a college at Oxford, later to become Christ Church College, and endowed it with the manor of Chadwick. Christ Church went on to become one of Britain's most distinguished seats of learning and a major tourist attraction, while little Chadwick remained a delightful rural backwater, with ponds fed by the infant Battlefield Brook, another of the region's waterways that rises on the Lickeys. The hills have also given rise to a number of legends. According to some superstitious locals in the Middle Ages, the devil's huntsman, Harry Canab, haunts the Lickeys on stormy nights, riding furiously on a winged horse. He's sometimes joined, we're told, by the ghost of a knight from Bromsgrove. This is Sir Ryalas, who, on a hunting expedition, slew a wild boar that turned out to be a witch. Now, if these tales are true, for those nominated to tend the beacons once sighted on the Lickeys, stormy nights must have been pretty scary. These beacons were part of a nationwide network, each one visible from at least one other, that would be lit to warn the country of impending danger. Sited on high points, they consisted of an iron basket mounted on a pole with ladder rungs attached, and surrounding villages were obliged to provide men to watch and ward the beacons round the clock in all seasons. Bromsgrove Manor and the Lickey Hills remained in royal hands and became traditionally part of the Queen's marriage settlement. The last royal lady of the manor of Bromsgrove was Charles II's wife. She apparently had no use of it, or maybe she was hard up. Anyway, in 1682 she sold it to the Earl of Plymouth, whose family would take considerably more interest in it than kings and queens ever had. The Earl, whose family name was Windsor, set up home at Hewell Grange at Tardybig, that in recent years has suffered numerous indignities. It became a prison, and the only substantial remains of the hall was the lodge that once formed a grand entrance to the estate. Even that was left to crumble, but happier days may lie ahead, because a local businessman has bought the buildings with the intention of restoring them to their former glory. All things deteriorate with neglect, and one of the most pressing problems for the new Lord of Bromsgrove back in 1682 was the condition of the region's roads. The upkeep of roads and bridges had for centuries been the responsibility of the parishes where they were situated, with heavy fines dished out to those who failed in their duty. Nevertheless, by the early 18th century, the country's roads were in a woeful state, many of them virtually impassable. Landowners like the Earl and his contemporaries decided to take matters into their own hands, joining forces to pay for road improvements in their own locality. Obviously, road improvements require materials, and it may be that the numerous quarries around the Lickeys provided them. Certainly this one at the Rubery end of Leech Green Lane was still supplying material for local footpaths well into the 20th century. To recover their costs, those responsible for the improvements erected barriers known as turnpikes, and charged tolls to anyone passing through. The route over the Lickey Hills was turnpiked in 1726, and the effect was remarkable. Stagecoaches began to take the shortcut from Worcester to the burgeoning industrial town of Birmingham. The long haul up the steep hill took its toll on the horses too, although it was 1912 before a trough was provided at the top. The old manorial court site found a new lease of life as a posting house where fresh teams of horses could be hired and tired ones rested. If getting up the hill was slow, getting down could be a little too quick, and groups of urchins, tramps and ne'er-do-wells hung onto the back of coaches, acting as extra brakes in return for the price of a drink at the bottom. Other undesirables too were attracted by the coming of the stagecoaches. Their slowness up the hills made them easy targets for highwaymen, with the Lickeys providing plenty of hiding places, and highway robbery became the scourge of travellers on this route. A gallows was erected at the top of Rose Hill to act as a deterrent, and the last pair of Lickey highwaymen were hanged at Worcester in 1806. The Lickey gallows were dismantled in the mid-19th century, and part of it was used in the construction of one of the cottages in Warren Lane. Another new structure by now occupied the Lickey Hills. This obelisk was erected in 1834 in memory of the 6th Earl of Plymouth. His claim to fame was establishing the Worcestershire Yeoman Cavalry in the early 1830s. These were turbulent times. The Industrial Revolution had swelled the working class populations of towns like Birmingham and Redditch. Many lived on the poverty line and were prone to frequently riot, targeting wealthy landowners to vent their frustrations upon. Although Robert Peel had formed a London police force in 1829, those outside the capital had no such protection, so local gentry and farmers formed yeomanry regiments to quell uprisings and protect their property. The 6th Earl died in 1833 childless, and the manor of Bromsgrove passed to his sister, Lady Harriet Windsor. She'd married a grandson of Clive of India and adopted the surname Windsor-Clive. The Lickeys represented a remote, poverty-stricken part of their considerable estates, and a survey showed that in 1851 With the exception of Farmer Greaves, all the inhabitants were either farm labourers or, lowest of the low, nail makers. Attracted initially by the promise of better wages than those earned by farm labourers, many found themselves trapped in a circle of exploitation and despair. Whole families slaved for long hours 7 days a week in cramped workshops behind their homes, in return for a pittance from the Bromsgrove nail masters, intent only on making their fortunes. As soon as they were old enough, children were set to work hammering out the nails that would hopefully keep the family fed for another week. For them, the Lickeys were not a place of happy memories, but nightmares. To their credit, the Windsor Clives seemed not oblivious to, or uncaring of, their tenants' plight. They built a school on top of the Lickeys, and another on the corner of Cofton Church Lane. Then, in 1855, gave land and money for a church close to Lickey School, in order that the poor of this remote district may enjoy the privileges of public worship and religious instruction. As well as building schools and churches, it was the Windsor Clives who embarked on large-scale forestation of the Lickey Hills, firstly draining large areas, then planting them with the conifers so typical of the hills today. By now, changes were also taking place at the foot of the hills. In June 1840, the Birmingham to Gloucester line of the Midland Railway opened from the south to Bromsgrove. On the 7th of September, a continuation opened to Cofton Farm, and little old unofficial Barnt Green, population 47, acquired its own station. Like the stagecoaches before them, trains too had problems with the steep slopes. The bank between Bromsgrove and Blackwell presented a particular challenge. Brunel proposed zigzagging up, but this was rejected on the grounds of cost. It was eventually decided that enough traction could be achieved by tackling the slope head-on, and the Lickey Bank gained a place in railway history as the steepest gradient in the country, with spare engines known as Lickey Bankers employed to push trains to the top. The arrival of the railway began to attract new visitors to the Lickeys from bursting at the seams Birmingham. Although they were still closed to the public, some who came here liked what they saw so much they decided to stay. One eminent Brummie who made the move early was Arthur Ryland, Mayor of Birmingham and founder of the Birmingham Institute. In 1867 he bought a plot on Lyndhurst Hill and built a fine house overlooking the Lickey Bank. The following year, American consul to Birmingham, Elihu Burritt, spent a night at the Rose and Crown and was moved to write, "It was just the English wayside inn I had read about from youth. Everything in it was thoroughly English, from the watering trough, skittle alley, beer mugs and all. And there was the landlady, a regular Saxon-faced and Saxon-haired woman, buxom, bland and radiant." A few years later, stagecoaches were redirected through Rubery along a new road, and a new Rose and Crown built to replace the old one. In 1880, the inn Burritt had found so enthralling was bought by Birmingham architect Mr. Wenham, who demolished it and built the structure we see today, landscaping the grounds at the same time. Word began to spread in smoky industrial Birmingham of the pleasures the Lickey Hills had to offer, and ambitious plans evolved to acquire them. In 1888, the Birmingham Society for the Preservation of Open Space completed the purchase of 22 acres of Rednal Hill that lay inside Kings Norton. They also persuaded the young Lord Robert Windsor, grandson of Lady Harriet, to lease them Pinfield Wood and Bilberry Hill for a peppercorn rent. A new era was about to dawn for the Lickey Hills. More than 800 years of enclosure ended, and a large part of them were accessible again. Five years earlier, a station had opened at Rubery, and trains regularly brought day trippers into there and Barnt Green. Horses and carts could be hired at the New Rose and Crown and the Plough, and the age of the bicycle was just beginning. Not everyone could afford train fares or bicycles, but that didn't stop them from getting here, and at holiday times the Bristol roads saw a steady flow of people walking to the Lickeys from Birmingham. It was starting to dawn on Lord Windsor that he may be able to cash in on the Lickey Hills' newfound popularity, and in 1889 large building plots on the south and western slopes were offered for sale. Smaller plots were made available at the bottom of the hills for shops and servants' cottages, and formed the platform for Barnt Green's expansion. The catalogue extolled the quality life on the Lickeys could offer. Clean and bracing air, and the finest views in the Midland counties. It also stipulated that the houses should be of a certain value, and that there shall be no public house, beer house, tea garden, public strawberry garden, or any place of public resort or entertainment. This was a clear attempt to lure people away from Lord Calthorpe's upmarket residential development at Edgbaston. But, despite the blurb, and the fact that Birmingham was now only 20 minutes from Barnt Green by express train, there was no great rush to abandon comfortable Edgbaston for the rugged splendour of the Lickeys. There were, though, some notable exceptions, including George and Edward Cadbury, of the famous Bourneville chocolate-making family. By 1900, there was a sizable cluster of large houses around Twatling Road, Plymouth Road, Mears Lane and Lyndhurst Road. In 1904, Birmingham's share of the Lickey Hills increased considerably. Barrow Cadbury had already donated these buildings at the foot of Bilberry Hill for use as tea rooms when George Cadbury bought 840 acres of the old Chadwick estate and gave it to the city. In 1907, Edward, George and Henry Cadbury bought Beacon Hill and also gave it to Birmingham. In 1913, the city bought Bilberry Hill from Lord Windsor and Cofton Hill that had been a game reserve for Hewell Grange. These were followed by Pinfield Wood. The Cadbury benefactions continued when, in 1919, George and Edward bought the old Rose and Crown estate, and 2 years later bought more land around it with the intention of creating an open-air theatre, a swimming pool, bowls and croquet lawns, tennis courts and a golf course. The theatre and pool never came to be, but the others were soon complementing the Lickeys' natural attractions. Birmingham people wasted no time in taking advantage of their new acquisition and soon had a quicker, cheaper way to get there. Bristol Road was the first city tram route connected to an overhead wire system. The road was widened to create a central reservation for the trams, and in 1924 the route was extended all the way to Rednal. Early on Easter Monday of that year, more than 10,000 excited Brummies descended on Navigation Street terminus here in Birmingham to board a Rednal 70 tram that would whisk them 100 at a time off to the Lickeys. Trams were drafted in from all over the city, and one left every minute to shake, rattle and roll along the Bristol road to paradise. The heyday for the Lickeys as a workers' playground had begun. Rednal took on the appearance of a holiday resort. Locals offered cream teas and accommodation. Bilberry Hill tea rooms were full to overflowing, and the bilberries that gave the hill its name were harvested by the basketful. City children marvelled in awe at the sight of bluebells and staggered back down the hills with armfuls of them. Families picnicked on the gentler slopes, children ran themselves to a standstill among the trees, and lovers strolled through the heather, hopelessly searching for a quiet spot. The hills were indeed alive. As evening drew in, the exodus started again in reverse, as the exhausted hordes descended on Rednal. A huge round shelter was built to protect the throngs waiting to go home, and 4 pubs in Rednal provided refreshment for those not so eager to. So great were the numbers, it was often the early hours before the last weary stragglers got back to Birmingham. These heady days continued throughout World War II, when the Lickeys provided a welcome, albeit temporary, escape from the horrors of the Blitz, and when it was over, fires again burned on Beacon Hill, symbolically fuelled by discarded blackout material and other obsolete items of war on the home front. In the glow of the flames just down the road at Longbridge was the factory that had been instrumental in making the celebration bonfires possible. The Austin had produced planes and other machines of war that had helped defeat Hitler. Its founder, Herbert Austin, had arrived in Birmingham in 1893 and in 1901 took over a derelict printing works at Longbridge to pursue his ambition of making motor cars. By 1906 he was personally test driving his first 4-cylinder touring car on the Lickey Hills he had grown so fond of. In 1909 he produced the first of his famous Austin 7s, and by 1936, when Austin was made a peer, his factory covered 200 acres with a workforce of 20,000. Herbert Austin built himself a house on the Bromsgrove slope of Old Birmingham Road, and when he died in 1941 was buried on top of Rose Hill at the heart of his beloved Lickeys, within earshot of the robots that will take the venture he began into a new millennium. Ironically, it was the efforts of men like Herbert Austin and his contemporaries that brought about the end of the heyday of the Lickey Hills. More and more working families could now afford cars and began to go further afield for days out and holidays. The last tram ran from here on the 6th of July 1952, a sad day for many. That famous shelter was removed shortly after, and all that remains of those halcyon days is a little piece of track and, of course, a million memories. The halcyon days may have gone, but the hills are still here, still popular and fiercely protected. In 1919, the Birmingham Post reported, "Birmingham has almost got Northfield in its urban clutches and now marches on to capture Rubery and Rednal. But the Lickeys provide an invulnerable front with their strong guard of tall fir rooted in quartzite and can never be captured." Let's hope they never are, so that future generations can continue to explore them, to discover secret places and create memories that never fade.